the day that we commemorate the birth, the enlightenment and parinibbana of the Buddha, of Gautama Buddha. And we'll begin by just reflecting on a saying of the Buddha, and it's in relation to this human birth. And what the Buddha says is, it's difficult to gain a human birth. It's difficult to have the life of a mortal. And it's difficult to have the opportunity to hear the true Dhamma. And it's difficult to have the arising of a Buddha in the world. And so today, like on Vesak Day, we should feel very fortunate that firstly, it's an auspicious day, but secondly, that we have come to the teachings of Gautama Buddha, and we have this precious human birth, that we are born with the ability, unlike some other creatures, to cognize, to understand the teachings of the Buddha, to understand the Dhamma, and to hear the Dhamma, and then to learn how to practice what the Buddha teaches. So today we start with feeling gratitude that we can come together to honor the Buddha. And we honor the Buddha by listening to his words, reflecting and contemplating on what he has said to us, and then rejoicing the fourfold Sangha. And in this way, we develop our minds, we calm our minds, and we work towards the goal of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is to realize the way out of dukkha. So that first verse was from the Dhammapada. And there's another verse in the Dhammapada which is also quite lovely. And the Buddha says, one who takes refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha sees right wisdom, the Four Noble Truths, the first truth of suffering, the second truth of the origin of suffering, which is tanha, the cessation of suffering, and the Noble Eightfold Path leading to the cessation of suffering. So this is our safe refuge. This is our supreme refuge, if you really think about it. And so when we come to this refuge, we can be free of all suffering. So this is what we are going to do today. We're going to actually activate some wisdom. And of course, we lean initially on the Buddha's wisdom, and then we practice and we develop further wisdom from that point. So today's topic is why Yonisomanasikāra is essential to the Noble Eightfold Path. And Yonisomanasikāra is a topic that people talk about, but they don't often know that they're talking about it. So we want to shed some light on Yonisomanasikāra and look at where it sits within the Buddha's teachings. So that's what we're going to be doing today, and how it supports us to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So what we'll be covering is we'll start off with our usual tips and reminders. It's good to get all of us onto the same page and to make sure that any newcomers also feel that welcome, and also to know that it's okay not to know everything that's being said during this session. We'll continue with some words from the Buddha to set the tone for what we mean by Yonisomanasikāra. And then we'll go about translating and defining what is Yonisomanasikāra. What is this word? What does it mean? What does the Buddha really mean by doing Yonisomanasikāra? And then we'll look at the importance of developing Yonisomanasikāra in Buddha's teaching themselves, because it's always good to see what the Buddha actually says about it, and then how he instructs to actually cultivate it. And then we'll do a deep dive. And by a deep dive into the application of it, it means we're going to do some contemplations. And it'll be a gradual process. So we trust in the Buddha's words, and we follow his instructions. And I think with these contemplations, we'll start off in a sort of straightforward, easy sense. But then as we go along, they'll get more deep. And so it will be a gradual process of deepening the insight into what Yonisomanasikāra really is. And I think in that way, by the end of it, we really get an idea about not just the translation and the words we use for Yonisomanasikāra in English, but by the end of it, we'll get a real feel for what is Ayonisomanasikāra, what is the opposite of it, and what is the actual, application of it itself. So that's our aim for our session today, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So tips and reminders. The thing about coming together for a session is there's different kinds of practices that we individually do, and also how much we know of the Buddha's words. So I think always take things fresh, like whatever we talk about today, listen with fresh ears, keep an open mind. Even if you're familiar with Yonisomanasikāra, open up to the fact that we're exploring this in a new sense and looking at various ways of understanding it better. And the other thing to say is there'll be some deep dhammas in what we go through, because we can't help but do that, because Buddha goes to, quite an advanced level. He's perfectly enlightened all on his own. And even with the words of arahants, they're enlightened as well. So not everything we will be able to understand. But what we can do is to make an attempt. And then when we can't understand, maybe it's not for right now, maybe it's for later. But we can learn how to do some of the meditations. And so the third thing is to remember that we're all learners, that none of us, as far as we know, are arahants. So we're all learning, we're all seeking to develop our minds in the right direction, for the right path and the right liberation. And so when we come from that perspective, then it's easier to listen and to follow and to attend to what the Buddha says. And during this session, we will definitely be doing meditation. We'll be definitely contemplating the Buddha's words in the sequence that he gives us. And so when we apply ourselves to the meditation, just give it a go. It's you just try a few steps. If you know how to do the meditation, then go right into it. And then also bring your own examples. That's always helpful. And I'll prompt that, because the best way for us to see the Dhamma for ourselves, which is what the Buddha says about the Dhamma, it's right here that we can actually practice it and know it for ourselves. Then if we bring our own examples, it brings it closer to us to actually see the truth, rather than denying it and seeing that it's out there somewhere or somewhere in the future. So the fact that we are here together today, it's a wonderful thing, particularly on Vesak. And so let's have good wishes for everyone that is here. But it's not easy to come to a session like this, that we have responsibilities, we have work, we have our family responsibilities, our friends, all kinds of responsibilities in our community. So it's not easy. So whoever has helped us to get to this session, whoever has helped us to set up Zoom, to get it running, whoever has just encouraged to come and sit and listen, have very good wishes. And, anyone that is able to go deeply into the mind with kindness and compassion, like the Brahma Viharas, like Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha, then you share that mind state with everyone that's on this call today, and with all sentient beings who may be listening as well. So that's how we will run the session. So we'll begin by looking at how we translate and define Yonisomanasikāra. Like, Pali words are often easier to use, because once you get a glimpse of the Pali word, and this might apply also in Sinhala, but definitely in Pali, it's fully weighted with the meaning. It's so much easier to handle. And so when we try and translate it into English, if we get it slightly wrong, it can veer us towards a misunderstanding of how to apply it, how to use it, how important it is sometimes as well. So we'll start off with Buddha's words. So this is from the Paṭhamasammattaniyāmasutta Sutta. And Mara was coming to see the Buddha and telling him that he hadn't done certain things, that he hadn't fully enlightened. And the Buddha was saying to him, by wise contemplation, so Yonisomanasikāra, by wise right striving, Yoniso Samappadana, I have arrived at unsurpassed liberation. I have realized unsurpassed liberation. And then the Buddha says, you too, by wise contemplation, by wise right striving, must arrive at unsurpassed liberation, must realize unsurpassed liberation. So these are inspiration for us. The Buddha is saying that it's through Yonisomanasikāra and also Yonisosamappadana that one can arrive at Nibbana and realize Nibbana. So that's our goal. So it may not be right now, but it's our goal. So we know that Buddha says Yonisomanasikāra is a very important thing, that it is something that will help us. And that's what we can get from his words here. The second thing that Buddha says is in another sutta. It's Paṭhamasekha Sutta. So we're seekers, we're learners, we're trainees on the Buddha's path. So Buddha says, there is no other thing of great assistance for a mendicant who is a learner for reaching the highest goal as wise contemplation, or Yonisomanasikāra. Wisely striving, a mendicant attains the destruction of suffering. So again, it's this encouragement that both of those two things, and the one we're focusing on today is definitely Yonisomanasikāra, this wise contemplation, because it's going to help us to reach the goal. Without it, as we'll see later on, it will veer us off the right path. And so it's very important for us to understand like the gravity, the weight of this particular thing that Buddha is asking us to do. So what does Yoniso mean? So we're going to break up each of the words. So we'll start with Yoniso. So Yonisomanasikāra is actually derived from a word called Yoni. And Yoni literally means the womb, but it could also mean origin or place of birth. And so what you get from that is this idea that it's based on something due to a source, that down to its origin, its roots, its foundation, we can see the process of where things arise and cease, something along those lines. So there's some kind of wisdom behind it. And that's where you get often wisely, thoroughly, properly, carefully, reasoned, methodically, judiciously, and clearly. It comes from this almost like investigation thing, that you're getting to the root of things, you're getting to the wisdom component of things. That's where Yoniso comes from. Ayoniso, we look at usually because it helps us to see the opposite, to actually see whether that fits as well. So it doesn't come from the origin. You don't go to the root or the foundation of its core, of its source. And so Ayoniso literally can mean not Yoniso. So in this case, it's unwisely, superficially, improperly, carelessly. I mean, all the synonyms are very similar. It's like you muddle through, you're distracted, you're careless with it. You don't really get to the bottom of it. That's Yoniso. And then we have Manasikara. So mano usually relates to the mind, and manasi is associated with the mind. So it's something mental. And then kara is usually the doing aspect, the working aspect, performing some kind of activity. So where you get to with that is you're working the mind, you're directing the mind. And it is definitely mental activity. So when we talk about meditation, we often think, oh, we need to still the mind. But the thing that we actually do in terms of the meditation is we develop the mind, we direct the mind in the right direction. And then only then, after going through the Noble Eightfold Path, do you start to achieve some sort of concentration, which is the stillness that comes from there. But initially, when people ask, what is meditation? It's really this manasikara part, that you are directing the mind, you are developing the mind, you're working the mind. And the question is always, where you're developing it to? Well, you're definitely directing it towards kusala, to the wisdom aspect of it. And so the words that come out of directing the mind, working the mind, mental activity is contemplation, consideration, you think things over. You can also use attention, like attending to it, pondering, deliberating, reflecting, mental examination, ideation. I mean, all these words, what you notice about them is that they have a very active part to the meaning of it. It's not a passive sit back and relax or sit back and observe. It's actually, what we'll see as we go further along is that you give it ingredients from the Buddha's words and you think it over, you consider it, you contemplate it, you direct the mind. So that's the thing about what we get to when we look at these words. So when you put them together, what you get is something along the lines of working the mind, directing the mind. What you also get is you do it with wisdom. So you get this wise contemplation, thorough consideration, reasoned thinking, careful deliberation, methodical reflection, proper examination, careful attention. I mean, sometimes what you find in the suttas is you always find attention, wise attention, careful attention, reasoned attention. My preference for this session is either to use Yonisomanasikāra, the Pali word itself, or to use something like wise contemplation or wise direction of the mind. And the reason for that is because it gives more emphasis on the activity that we need to do with our minds, as opposed to sitting back. Because sometimes what you get when you use wise attention is it's more like you simply observe. But when we get into the deep dive into how we do Yonisomanasikāra, it's not that at all. Buddha's actually giving us instructions to contemplate. So Yonisomanasikāra, it's actually better to either use the Pali word or to say wisely directing the mind or wise contemplation. So where we get to with that is that the question that we come away with is, what are we carefully directing the mind towards or away from in order to arrive at Nibbana? That's where you get to when you get through the translation and definition of Yonisomanasikāra. The question that really comes to the mind is, what are you carefully directing it towards or away from? Is it everything? Is it nothing? Or is it some things? And so with this session, that's what we're going to be looking at. What is the Buddha saying we need Yonisomanasikāra towards? And the answer to that will be where we get to as we go along. We'll really, really see what it is. So when we come to the importance of Yonisomanasikāra, what we come to is that in this particular sutta, it's Yonisomanasikārasampadā Sutta. It's also again in the Dutiyayonisomanasikārasampadā Sutta. And the Buddha says, mendicant, this is the forerunner and precursor of the rising sun. That is the dawn. So too mendicants, for a mendicant, this is the forerunner and precursor for the arising of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is accomplishment in wise contemplation. When a mendicant accomplished in wise contemplation, it is to be expected that one will develop and cultivate this Noble Eightfold Path. So we already see some of the answer to this question. Question of where should we be directing the mind? It's like if we direct it using Yonisomanasikāra, it will enable the arising of the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path being the way out of dukkha, the way leading out of dukkha, the fourth noble truth. So that's the first thing that Buddha says, that if you're accomplished in Yonisomanasikāra, in this wise contemplation, then one is expected to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So a good way of looking at things is always to look at Yonisomanasikāra, so what is the unwise contemplation or unwise directing of the mind, and then we'll look at the wise contemplation. So in this funnel diagram, what you see is, what the Buddha says is, there are two conditions for the arising of wrong view. So parato goso is when you hear another's words, and ayonisomanasikāra is the unwise contemplation. So these two things, when you put it into the funnel, you get out the wrong view. So what the Buddha is saying is, after having heard the wrong things, in this case, you contemplate unwisely, so you muddle it up, you don't have care with what you've listened to, and maybe it's the wrong Dhamma. And so once that happens, wrong view arises, and once it arises and you keep continuing to do the same thing, then it continues to grow. Now, we don't realize it, but we spend a lot of time in the wrong view. And the reason for that is because we listen to the wrong things. We're not always listening to the Buddha's words. So, for example, Parato Goso, in this sense of wrong view, comes from listening to the TV, listening to the news, listening to people who are talking about very mundane, worldly things that don't point to the truth of things. It's also stories, it's foolish people. Sometimes it's even people teaching Dhamma that don't come back to the Buddha's words, that they make up different Dhammas. And there might be some relative truth in them, but it always lands you, when you look at this funnel, it lands you in the wrong view, because even if you reflect on things, if you reflect on those particular instructions, and even if you're quite diligent towards it, you could end up in the wrong view. And this also means that Parato Goso is like you're hanging out with the wrong kind of company and you're hearing the wrong kind of dhammas. So that's Yonisomanasikāra. That's how you get to the wrong view. And so the Buddha says in the Vipallāsa Sutta, and it's quite nicely here, is that perceiving impermanence as permanence. So anicca instead of anicca. Suffering as happiness. So sukha rather than dukkha. Not me and mine as me and mine. So atta instead of anatta. And then unattractiveness as beauty. So you see subha rather than asubha. So these are the vipallasas. They're like perversions of the mind, corruptions of the mind, if you will. So this is where, when we hear the wrong dhammas, these are the four things, these four corruptions that keep entering our minds. And then what Buddha says is sentient beings are ruined by wrong view, deranged, out of their mind, yoked by Mara's yoke. These people find no sanctuary from the yoke. Sentient beings continue to transmigrate with ongoing birth and death. So usually the wrong kind of Dhamma and the unwise contemplation, they go hand in hand with these perversions, these corruptions. And when we actually get to do the contemplations ourselves, we'll really see that. But for now, just take that on board. And if you understand these Buddha's words, then that's very good. Keep them at the forefront of your mind, because these corruptions, they start off as perceptions in the mind, but then they become the way we think, our usual way of thinking. And then after that, they become very strong views. So they start off as sannyas, then citta, then ditthis. So there are actually 12 corruptions of the mind when you go 3 by these 4. So that's the other thing to know about that. Now, on the other hand, which is what we're looking at today very much, is cultivating Yonisomanasikāra. It's wise contemplation, wisely directing the mind. Again, 2 conditions. The Buddha says there's 2 conditions for the right view to arise. It's Parato Goso and Yonisomanasikāra. So hearing another's words and wisely contemplating. The difference between ayoniso and yoniso in terms of like the wrong view and right view is where we're getting the words from. So in this case, Parato Goso means the Buddha's words. And if you ask the Arahants and they teach something, all those words they would say also come from the Buddha. They don't claim it for themselves. So what I'm reading out today, it all comes from the Buddha. And so this is the good company. When we listen to the Buddha, when we listen to the Arahants, when we listen to people who are practicing the Buddha's teachings, then this is the Parato Goso that where we're coming from, the right Saddhamma really. So the Saddhamma being the true Dhamma. And together they make the Parato Goso. And when you combine that with wise contemplation, the Yonisomanasikāra, then where you get to is this right view, samadhi. And so Buddha says, when you contemplate wisely, having heard the Buddha's words, then right view arises, and once it's arisen, it grows. And so if you think about it this way, the more we listen to the Buddha's words, the more we follow his instructions to contemplate wisely, and he does give specific instructions throughout the suttas, throughout his teachings, then our right view arises and it grows. And when we stray off the right path, we bring it back with Yonisomanasikāra again. We keep bringing it back. That's how you reactivate the right view. Yonisomanasikāra isn't something that you use once on this path. You use it all the time. And where Buddha talks about at the beginning, when we were saying about wise right striving, it is the wise right striving that helps us to keep doing that. We make the effort, we put the energy in to keep doing that. The other thing that we also find about the Buddha's teaching about Yonisomanasikāra is that it's always about applying the Buddha's medicine. When we get to the deep dive of applying Yonisomanasikāra, you see the medicine is like the asubha, the dukkha, the anatta, anicca. It's all the things which are the opposite of the way we normally think. So rather than subha, rather than beauty, we keep looking to see the unattractiveness, so we don't get duped. We don't fall into the trap of the wrong view. Same with like dukkha. If we keep seeking sukha and we constantly think that there's no dukkha, we keep patching it up, so to speak, then we get perverse again. Our minds get corrupted. So Yonisomanasikāra always has medicine within it. The application of it is always saying, there's medicine that Buddha has asked me to use. And this applies when the hindrances arise, when there are, we experience sorrow and suffering and grief, despair. We need to know, what does the Buddha say to apply at that time? Because we do slide. Even the best practitioners at the moment slide. We slide into greed, hatred, and delusion, and we have to pull ourselves up again using this Yonisomanasikāra. And Buddha does give very clear instructions, and so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Because if we do this, if we can know when to apply the medicine using this Yonisomanasikāra, then we actually learn to develop the mind, and we learn to develop the Noble Eightfold Path. So the second part to that Vipallāsa Sutta is really about this, what we just spoke about. Buddha says, but when the Buddhas arise in the world, shedding radiance, they shine a light on this teaching that leads to the stilling of suffering. When a wise person hears them, they get their mind back, seeing impermanence as impermanence. So anicca as anicca, suffering as suffering, dukkha as dukkha, not me and mine as not me and mine, anatta as anatta, and ugliness as ugliness, or unattractiveness as unattractiveness. So asubha as asubha, taking up the right view. They've risen above all suffering. So right now, for some of us, this may not make full sense. We may not have the direct insight right now, right at this moment where we've just read out the Buddha's words. But not to worry, because when we get to the contemplations, you'll start to see this. But for those who actually know, then this is just a kind reminder that Yonisomanasikāra, when we apply it using our listening to the Buddha, our trust in the Buddha, then this is what happens. Like, we actually do see anicca as anicca, impermanence as impermanence, dukkha as dukkha, suffering as suffering, and anatta as anatta, not me and mine as not me and mine, and asubha as asubha, ugliness as ugliness. And this is where we get back on track for the right view if we've lost it, or if we don't have it, we're seeking to enable it to arise, unarisen right view to arise. So it's very simple. Out of this first part of what we've spoken about, it's really saying, listen carefully to the Buddha's words, paratogoso. Listen carefully to the Saddhamma. Saddhamma we can trust can only really come from Buddha. And that's what we need to constantly touch and make contact with, the Saddhamma. And by hanging out, associating with good people, because they're the ones that also associate with the Buddha's words, then we listen carefully, and then we follow the directions. So we apply Yonisomanasikāra, because the directions give us the Buddha's medicine, and it leads us to the right view. The right view leads the Noble Eightfold Path. That's what you hear in the suttas. It always leads with right view. If you have right view, you go to the right path. Otherwise, you go to the wrong path. So it's very, very important. The other thing that one can say is that there are three kinds of wisdom that the Buddha talks about. Let me just quickly go back to this last slide. There are three things that Buddha talks about in terms of wisdom. He talks about Sutta Panya. So this is the understanding or the wisdom that comes from hearing or learning the Buddha's words. Then the Chintamaya Panya, which is the understanding or the wisdom that comes from thinking, from directing the mind, contemplating the Dhamma. And then the fourth one is Bhavanamaya Panya, which is developing the mind, developing through the Dhamma. That's the wisdom and the understanding that grows. What you can get from Parato Goso and Yonisomanasikāra together is you start to develop Suttamaya Panya and you're working towards Chintamaya Panya. Because Parato Goso, the listening to the Buddha's words, the words of the wise, and the contemplation that you do from wisdom, it develops this initial wisdom. So initially with Suttamaya Panya, this wisdom or understanding that comes from hearing and listening to the Dhamma, we lean on Buddha's words. We lean on his full awakening, the wisdom that came with that. And then as we cultivate this ourselves, we start moving towards Chintamaya Panya because we start to develop the mind with right view. So we start to contemplate wisely. And eventually, as we develop the Noble Eightfold Path, and particularly as we get to Samma Samadhi, that's where you start to develop Bhavanamaya Panya, the wisdom and understanding through developing. So what you see right here is when you have the right view, so assuming that one has Parato Goso and Yonisomanasikāra, so hearing the Buddha's words, following the instructions, and wisely contemplating, you get to right view. Right view then means you have the Noble Eightfold Path. So you have the right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and right effort. These are our sila is included within that. Then what comes is right mindfulness. We know what to maintain in order to keep on the path. And then what are the wise nutriments for that? And then we get to Samma Samadhi, the right concentration. And this is where Bhavanamaya really kicks in because this is where you're starting to truly develop the mind properly. And therefore out of that you get Samma Jnana, which is the right knowledge, and then Samma Vimukti, which is the right liberation. So this is really what meditation is all about. If someone asks you, what is Buddha's meditation about? What is Bhavana about? This is really what it is about. But you don't get to the Noble Eightfold Path unless you have Yonisomanasikāra and the Buddha's instructions. So what we see in the world, whether people are in Dhamma or not in Dhamma, is this ayonisomanasikāra, which leads to wrong view. So if someone is not hearing the Buddha's words, so they go about their lives, the normal conventional life, they have never heard the Buddha's words. They have no idea what Yonisomanasikāra is, so they're not wisely contemplating. So then it's quite easy to say that they have the wrong view. They're imbued with ignorance and delusion. So it's a greed, hatred, and delusion path, whereas the opposite, the right view, is the non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion path. So when you're on the wrong view side, then you develop wrong intention, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood. You don't understand why there is a need to keep some form of sila in order to walk the Noble Eightfold Path. You don't make the right effort. And even if you do make effort, say you are in some kind of spiritual practice, you might be making effort, but on the wrong things. And so you get a different kind of mindfulness or no mindfulness if you're not a practitioner. And then you develop wrong concentration in the wrong areas. And so wrong knowledge, wrong liberation. So that's where you find people who are having spiritual practices, even at the time of the Buddha, they could get to very concentrated mind states. They could be very mindful, but it was not leading to Nibbana. It just still stays in some form of existence, rebirth into some form of existence in samsara. So when you see this, like the difference between Yonisomanasikāra and Ayonisomanasikāra, and the type of words that you're listening to, then you know you need to always check. You need to always check that you've got the right instructions. You're developing right view, not wrong view, and kicking off, leading with that. So that's why this is very, very important. In fact, it's probably the most important thing to know before you meditate. Because you could be spending many, many years meditating, but you're not going to the right place and you won't be liberated. And so it could be a waste of time in some sense. But once someone points you to this, it's a real blessing, like a very, very real blessing, because then you're on the right path, the right practice, you develop the right wisdom and knowledge, and then the right vimuktis, really. Your ceto vimukti, liberation of the mind, panya vimuktis, liberation through wisdom, and then nibbana. So the Buddha also says this. Buddha says that what is the one thing that is conducive to decline or falling off? Hana bhagyo. And the answer is unwise contemplation. So even if you start off even in the right path, we veer off so we can decline. But if we have Yonisomanasikāra, Buddha says it's the one thing that leads to distinction or progress. Visesa bhagyo, wise contemplation, Yonisomanasikāra. So one leads to decline or falling off, the other one leads to distinction and progress. It's good to know that. It's very good to know that. And that's why you think before you meditate, it's good to know, is your mind pointing in the right direction? And have you got the instructions in order to do so? Okay, so in terms of importance, we can go through a few things, at least to get our mind pointing in the right direction, because that's the thing about Yonisomanasikāra. We want to know which direction are we pointing it in? Are we pointing it to everything? Clearly, it's not everything. Are we pointing it to nothing? No, it's definitely not that. And it is definitely some things. So the first thing we've already spoken about is this Noble Eightfold Path, that Yonisomanasikāra is very important for the arising of the Noble Eightfold Path. And once it's arisen, it can go to fulfillment. So part of the Four Noble Truths, when it comes to what the Buddha says about this, the three stages of insight, when it comes to the first Noble Truth of dukkha, it's always about understanding it. When it comes to tanha, the origin of suffering, like the craving that keeps us coming back, we want to abandon all of that once we understand what that means. When it comes to the cessation of the suffering, so the nirodha, Buddha says that we want to realize the cessation. And then when it comes to the way out, which is this Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddha always says we want to actually develop this path. And so Yonisomanasikāra helps us to develop this path to fulfillment, to the end of it. And then the second thing, in terms of another part that the Buddha says, is that Yonisomanasikāra is one of 5 qualities that enables entry to the right path with regards to skillful qualities, so kusala, even when listening to true Dhamma. So the important thing about this is that the 5 things are: you don't disparage the Dhamma or the talk, you don't disparage the person that's giving the talk, you don't disparage yourself as you're listening to the talk, and you allow the mind to get settled and unified, so one-pointed when you're listening to true Dhamma. And then the other component is Yonisomanasikāra. So whenever you listen to a Dhamma talk from anyone, and whenever you're reading the Dhamma, or hearing like even just the suttas read out, these 5 things are very important. Don't disparage yourself, don't disparage the speaker, don't disparage the teaching that's been given. Allow the mind to settle into the Dhamma. Don't let it get distracted and all over the place. And apply contemplation as you're listening, which is what the encouragement today is. With Yonisomanasikāra, as you listen to what we're going through of the Buddha's words, allow your mind to contemplate, from time to time. And then when we actually do the contemplations, specifically the deep dive into Yonisomanasikāra, give yourself the opportunity for that as well. Now, the opposite is true of this, that when it comes to Yonisomanasikāra, if we disparage the talk, if we disparage the person sharing the Dhamma at the time, if we disparage oneself as we're listening, if we don't allow the mind to settle, and if we don't wisely contemplate while we're listening, then we can't enter the right path. So that's the important thing. The third thing is from another sutta that says Yonisomanasikāra is one of the causes for doing good deeds. And that makes sense because Yonisomanasikāra is always pointing to kusala, to skillful qualities. So of course it's going to be pointing as well towards doing good deeds. It's from that reason that we do good deeds. And then the last one on this slide is, when you wisely contemplate, skillful qualities arise and unskillful qualities decline. I mean, once you direct yourself to right view, then of course one will want to have virtues dear to the noble ones, kusala qualities, dasakusala, the 10 wholesome actions through body, speech and mind, as opposed to the other ones where you're negligent, unheedful, doing whatever you like. Buddha's words, when you have Yonisomanasikāra, when you wisely contemplate, you realize actually you can't afford to do that. You have to honor his words because you've seen something in them. That you keep going to dukkha if you are unwisely giving attention to things, unwisely contemplating. And then, of course, based on what we looked at last Poya, we looked at stream entry last Poya, we looked at the Vipallāsa Sutta last Poya, then we know that Yonisomanasikāra is one of the 4 factors leading to stream entry. So alongside good company, alongside listening to the true Dhamma, and then Yonisomanasikāra, and then practicing in accordance with the Dhamma, it is one of the 4 factors leading to stream entry. So very, very important. Now, when we look at the next one, Buddha says greatly beneficial. Already we can see why it's greatly beneficial, because we're putting the mind in the right place. And when it's in the right place, it enables us to see through things, see things as they really are. And that's what we're hoping to see today. And then the third thing on this page is, it's why greed, hatred, and delusion do not arise, and arisen greed, hatred, and delusion are abandoned. Well, if we apply Yonisomanasikāra, we come to the right view, and that's the leading of the Noble Eightfold Path. That is the path that is non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. So we see why this is the case. Then the fourth thing on this page is, when we wisely contemplate, then unarisen taints do not arise. So these taints are the asavas. These are the things that are deeply rooted and connected with ignorance. And they're very, very difficult. This is the last things that we uproot. And we can only do that with the Buddha's instructions. There's probably nothing that we need to go through here in detail today, but it's just something to bear in mind. And the last one on this page is, when you wisely contemplate, the unarisen hindrances do not arise, and the arisen hindrances are abandoned. And what's really true about this is where you see in a practical sense that we need to apply Buddha's medicine when hindrances arise, because these are the ones that don't enable us to concentrate easily. We can't get to Samma Samadhi very easily when the hindrances are there. So the hindrances are like sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, or sometimes dullness and drowsiness, restlessness and worry, and doubt. And so when those hindrances are there, it's very difficult to concentrate the mind, very difficult to make the mind happy, because it's toiling in these wrong, unwholesome states, and it's looping, continually looping. And so Yonisomanasikāra, in a more practical sense, is knowing what is the medicine for sensual desire, what is the medicine for ill will, what is the medicine for dullness and drowsiness, what is the medicine for restlessness and worry, what is the medicine for doubt. Knowing that, you apply it, you contemplate it. And we're going to do 1 or 2 of those today. Now, what the Buddha says as well in the suttas is, mendicants, whatever states there are that are wholesome, partaking of the wholesome, so kusala, pertaining to the wholesome. They are all rooted in wise contemplation, converge upon wise contemplation, and wise contemplation is declared to be the chief among them. When a mendicant is accomplished in wise contemplation, it is to be expected that he will develop and cultivate the 7 factors of enlightenment. Now, what you find in the suttas is that hindrances are always subdued and enlightenment factors are activated, the bojjhangas. And Yonisomanasikāra plays a huge part in that, and also a huge part in sharpening our spiritual faculties, because we're always, as this Buddha says, we're always in the wholesome, we're always in the kusala, we're always partaking of the kusala, pertaining to the kusala. Everything is rooted and converging through wise contemplation in the kusala. So in that way, that's the only way bojjhangas can arise. Now, the bojjhangas, as we know, are mindfulness, sati, Dhamma Vichaya, which is the investigation of Dhamma. And that is very close to this Yonisomanasikāra as well. Like when you investigate the Dhamma, it's very much like wise contemplation. And then energy, which is virya, piti, which is rapture or joy, passaddhi, which is tranquility, and then concentration, which is samadhi. So you can see these bojjhangas, as well as the other aids or wings to awakening, they all help us. So the spiritual faculties, the powers, the basis of spiritual power, all these things, including the Noble Eightfold Path, they all converge together to enable us to get to Samma Samadhi. And when we get to Samma Samadhi, that's where the real work starts to happen, to really see through things. That's where the white light really comes in, the radiance of the Buddha, the real wisdom light kicks in. So that's why, again, this is why Yonisomanasikāra is very important, that when we follow the Buddha's instructions, then all these things start to converge. Unarisen enlightenment factors arise, and arisen enlightenment factors eventually go to fulfillment or development. So the more you abide, the more you cultivate Yonisomanasikāra, then what happens is a lot of these things that help us to liberate, to become wiser human beings, to become liberated eventually, they all start to develop. And that's why even arahats, they continue to practice, because it's actually a very happy mind state. Once you know the Buddha's teachings, once you enter the stream, realize the fruits of the Buddha's words, then what happens is, for the rest of our lives, it doesn't have to be so miserable, because we know where the danger is. And we're going to see a glimpse of that when we start to contemplate. And so the second thing on here is, it's one of the 8 causes for wisdom. So we already know through Sutta Maya Panya that this wisdom, through hearing the Buddha, through learning the Buddha's teaching, learning the Dhamma, it's already a cause for wisdom, this Yonisomanasikāra. But more so than that, as we develop it, it ripens and matures. And then the other thing that it said is, it enables a noble disciple to clearly see and thoroughly penetrate the noble method with wisdom, through wisely contemplating and thoroughly dependent origination. What that really means is that where you get to with Yonisomanasikāra eventually is, you start to unlock dependent origination. You unlock the links of why we come to be, why we create this body, and why we don't want to create this body in any kind of existence. So the noble method is really understanding Paṭiccasamuppada. And that's where you see the Yoniso come from, that it's getting to the root of things. It's getting to the reason for how this all came to be, how we keep coming to samsara. So that's something we'll get a glimpse of, because one of the meditations we're going to do is to look at that, one of the links in the Paṭiccasamuppada. And then lastly, it says, it enables true knowledge and liberation to be developed rather than ignorance. So this is a sutta, the Avijja Sutta, that we always touch on, because it's such a wonderful sutta to see how things come to be, to see how we create ignorance and how we don't do that and create true knowledge and liberation. So if we go to this diagram, and this has been used before, if you've seen this before, it's probably because you've seen it in Unlocking the Buddha's Code, or you've seen it when there's been a Q&A about name entry. And on the left side, what you have is the akusala. And the akusala always leads to ignorance, so avidya. And then on the right-hand side, you have kusala. So kusala is the wholesome side, and this is what leads you to vijja, vimukti, so true knowledge and liberation. So when we look at this, what we really want to look at is how all this comes to be. Like, what is it that is actually driving all of this? So the important part is to actually see on the left-hand side here, it's like a bit of a process. If we start with akusala, what we're paying attention to is this unwise contemplation is in the middle here. And you also notice when you look at stream entry, the 4 factors, you have 4 factors, we'll look at the right side, sorry. The 4 factors are you associate with good people, you hear the true Dhamma, of course that gives you confidence and conviction in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha. And then you have Yonisomanasikāra, and then the rest of all of this, from mindfulness and clear comprehension all the way down to true knowledge and liberation, this is the practice. We're practicing in accordance with the Dhamma. And so Yonisomanasikāra enables that. It's in the middle of that. Paratagoso is this associating with good people, hearing the Buddha's words, developing trust, confidence, leaning on the Buddha's wisdom, and then you get to wisely contemplating, then you practice, and then you liberate. On the unwholesome side, it's different. You associate with the wrong company. So the people that don't have the wisdom, they're not walking the Eightfold Path, they're heedless. So you're not hearing the true Dhamma. You're not hearing the Buddha's words. Instead, you're hearing other things, things that dupe you, trick you, betray you in the end. Because at the end of this life, if you've got just these wrong Dhammas, then you keep coming back to samsara, and it doesn't guarantee a human birth. If you remember Buddha's words, like human birth is very hard to attain. So there's always a risk, and it's quite unsafe. And therefore, because you don't hear any of this, you're not associating with people who are walking the path or associating with the Arahants and the Buddha, then there is no saddha. There's no conviction. There's no trust in the Buddha's words. You can't even lean on the Buddha's wisdom. And so you keep being heedless. So you don't contemplate wisely. There's nothing, you contemplate worldly dhammas instead, politics, natural disasters, things that happen at work, relationship issues, all kinds of worldly dhammas, getting rich, things that are happening on the stock market, things that are happening in one country and another country, so on and so forth. They're mundane things. There might be relative truths in them, but they're not ultimately liberating, and you'll still be bound to samsara. And so when you practice, so for a worldly person who's caught up in the world, then really you have all of this lack of mindfulness, the lack of sense restraint. You don't keep any virtue, no sila, body, speech, and mind. And you're always with the hindrances, so you can't concentrate the mind. You ask a worldly person to sit still and just be with themselves, it's very difficult, because what troubles them is all the things in the mind that arise. These are the 5 hindrances. There's a lot of wanting, there may be a lot of aversion, there may be a lot of restlessness, there may be a lot of maybe even dullness, drowsiness, just wanting to veg out. And then there's plenty of doubt, because when things happen, doubt comes up and says, why did that happen? Why? And then you can't understand it. So on this side, when you're with the wrong company and you don't hear the Buddha's words, a lot of this happens. And so you're always creating more ignorance. What made us come into the world was ignorance. And what will ensure we persist in the world is ignorance. And so when you see this, you realize how important kusala is, this particular process is. Because Buddha, he only gives you the best medicine. Because Buddha has seen that if we don't correct our view, then we'll be toiling for eons and eons, as we have done already in samsara, and there's no way out. So Buddha says, it's not by just virtue alone, it's not by eating a particular diet, it's not by standing on one leg or following politics or any of those things. Only the Noble Eightfold Path will take us out of samsara. So this is what the Avijja Sutta tells us, and that's where you see wise contemplation right here. This is where it sits. So you need to know where it sits in the context of the Buddha's teaching. It's very, very important, because this is where your right view gets determined. The other thing to say is that when you may be practicing Dhamma, you may also know people who are practicing Dhamma, but they may not actually be practicing the right Dhamma. This also falls on the akusala side, because although they may be mindful, and it may not even be Buddhist mindfulness, but another form of mindfulness, and they might have very good mindfulness, like mindfulness enough to concentrate very well. But the thing is, a lot of things may be missing from that. And therefore, sometimes you see, oh, they're not keeping any kind of virtue. They don't restrain their senses. The virtue is not very good. And then even when outside of meditation, maybe the hindrances are always troubling them. And so then you can see, okay, this is the pathway that they are still going on. They haven't seen it yet. So that's the distinction. Okay, so that's the first part of the session. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do some application of Yonisomanasikāra. So before we do that, what I'd like to do is just take a 5-minute break to let that first part of the session sink in. And if we need a comfort break or anything like that, have a drink of water or something like that, just take that now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come back and we're gradually going to contemplate. So take that 5 minutes now. We'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll begin again with some meditation. Teruvan Saranai.